World Universities Championship Grand Final, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister from Monash, Mr. Tim Jeffries.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to have survived this tournament, and even bigger pleasure to have survived the Ambassador Hotel, at least for now. Madam Speaker, victims in this scenario fail to get redress in the criminal justice system, and the government in this debate stands up for supporting the people who never accepted this type of risk in the long term, and we think that we have a positive obligation to assist them. The solution of the opening government is very simple. Firstly, we think this debate occurs in the first world predominantly because that's where those health services are able to be involved in this sort of system, and also we think the judiciary has the ability to be involved. What our policy is going to be is, firstly, it should be criminal absolutely everywhere if you knowingly infect someone with HIV/AIDS. That's not the status quo everywhere. It is in some countries, but not in others. In addition to that, irrespective of your knowledge of your own HIV status, if you infect someone with HIV, what will then happen is the state will have a statutory organisation where you apply as a victim to receive contribution from the person who infected you. We think that contribution should be substantial. We say it should be 50% of what you would receive otherwise. We think that's what they have an obligation to do, ladies and gentlemen. We see that occurring all the time in things like child support payments. We don't think this is any particularly different. Moreover, we say we see governments doing it all the time with victims of crimes tribunal where the state pays you out if you have had this sort of problem. That's what we're going to talk about. That's the model that we are implementing. I'm going to talk about, firstly, the role of victims in this debate and how it's unfair on the individual. My second point will be changing sexual practices, and my third point will be the effect on victims. The Deputy Prime Minister will talk about general awareness and the influence, no thank you sir, the influence on certain groups in society, particularly minorities. Let's go on firstly to why this is unfair on individuals. I've already mentioned that there's a policy, often in first world governments, no thank you, that a lot of countries have this as a criminal offence. We don't think that's good enough in today's debate because it doesn't address the long-term consequences of someone who has HIV/AIDS. This is an illness that is a life sentence for people, ladies and gentlemen. This isn't a transitory beating of somebody. This is something that will affect you forever. John?
Why is it appropriate knowingly to impoverish someone who unknowingly infects someone with HIV and often let the families go on?
Firstly, we'd say we impoverish people like single fathers for paying, their wives, and secondly, because they caused it, John. They're the ones who gave them AIDS. We think they have a moral obligation to pay them out. Moreover, we'd say it forces them to be far more careful in the bedroom when there's such a financial incentive not to have sex with things without a condom. No thank you. What happens when people get infected with HIV/AIDS? Firstly, they have to bear the substantial price of antiretroviral drugs. Even in the first world, where we have things like a pharmaceutical benefit scheme or a national health service, there's still a substantial financial contribution the victim has to make. Moreover, in countries like the United States, there isn't that system to cover those people. No thank you. Whilst we think it's important that you morally sanction someone through criminal procedures, ladies and gentlemen, we think that firstly, that doesn't address the need, but moreover, our model captures those who necessarily didn't break the law, those who didn't know they had HIV/AIDS. Yes, sir. Well, firstly, if you're wearing a condom, we don't think you're going to give them AIDS, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's a pretty basic concept of physiology. We'd say, ladies and gentlemen, that in those cases, the judiciary can often find solutions if they need to. They do it all the time right now. What I'm going to say, the problem in making this about knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, is that people have no way to consent to this sort of activity, ladies and gentlemen. It's unfair for an individual, ladies and gentlemen, who never contributed to this, to have to pay the cost of something they never ever accepted. They never ever said yes to, ladies and gentlemen. We just don't think that's acceptable in the current moral climate that we live in, especially when we do it, ladies and gentlemen, for criminals or victims of crime all the time. This is my second point about sexual practices. This creates a financial direct incentive to be incredibly careful when you have sex with someone, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, it provides a substantial incentive to use a condom, which we think is pretty simple to do. This isn't an onerous task we're asking someone to do, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you, I can make a cheap joke, but I'm not going to. We'd say that, moreover, this provides an incentive to get yourself tested, and that's something the current system just does not do. Because if you know in the current system, ladies and gentlemen, you're criminally liable. If you don't know, you're not. And we don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that the current structures, no thank you sir, the current structures are good enough to control this type of activity. Moreover, we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, when you have a financial disincentive, when you have a financial penalty involved, that often will change people's behaviour. When you have to pay things like, and we accept it will cost something like $10,000 a year to pay for these sorts of antiretroviral drugs. We think single dads have to do that all the time, or single mothers when they have to fund the fact that they have to fund, things like alimony. We think that's perfectly acceptable in the current scenario, ladies and gentlemen. We think in the long term, we think in the long term you change practices. My final point is about victims. Ladies and gentlemen, we think you send a positive message, ladies and gentlemen, when you have to directly pay for the consequences of your actions, which will often have consequences for 40 or 50 years. We think that's an obligation. We also think the criminal system is failing victims right now. The state doesn't assist them in a proper enough manner. They don't provide the proper victim services, but moreover, we just think a criminal sanction isn't a good enough solution when you've actually given a long-term health problem to someone in the future. We think, ladies and gentlemen, moreover, when you have committed a criminal offence, victims are completely without redress. Victims have absolutely nothing to do. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, the push in things like civil law, when you can sue somebody for having also committed assault, which you may appear before the criminal tribunal, is an incredibly positive sort of movement in the criminal justice system. We embrace that sort of thing in this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we think people who are infected with HIV/AIDS are left out in the cold. We think someone should have to stand up and pay the bill, and that's the person who infected it in the first place.
To commence the case for the opposition, I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition, Ms. Valerie Murdoch.
Where we have state control. But we say, whatever happens, we've also had no provision as to what's going to happen if the person who infects you has no money. And we say, at the basic level of their model, we've not really had much analysis about how this is related to the person who's doing the infecting as well, and exactly how this works in Western liberal healthcare systems. We say, in the Western liberal democracies that he's talking about, we do have basic healthcare, and we don't think that somebody infecting someone else with HIV is a reason for them to pay towards medical costs. We just think that's inconsistent with other healthcare needs. And then we have this confusion about the issue of whether this is done knowingly or unknowingly. We say when people infect other people knowingly, we say by definition that's going to lead to, as they admitted, an incentive people protesting. So we say that's damaging. But we say more so, if you're saying that if somebody infects someone unknowingly, they're still guilty, then we say that's crazy. Because considering the proposition are so concerned about the victims, how on earth do we determine who is the victim and who is the perpetrator when we simply do not know? We say that's nonsense. We say if you don't know you're doing something, how can you possibly be liable? And we say people who are infected by definition have HIV themselves, and therefore under their model, by definition, should be protected. Okay, so why is this so unjust? Well, we say this falls under two things. We say firstly, sex is like fundamental part of self-expression and fundamental part of self-actualization. We say humans do not live in a vacuum. We interact with each other, and relationships, particularly sexual relationships, are central to existence. We say without having this right, people can't function truly as human beings. We say this model encourages people that even when there is full disclosure and even when there is consent, it encourages the message that you should not engage in sexual activity. Because even if your partner has consented, there is still a risk that you could be liable. And they told us, you know, it's okay because condoms are 100%. And we say, firstly, that's not true. And secondly, we think there's going to be this perception that HIV people simply are not people that should be engaging in sexual activity. We see that's hugely damaging, don't you think?
Boy, all these seems to be arguments against things like child support payments, because there's a chance if you use a condom, you might be just a child. Is that are you guys against that sort of stuff?
To be honest with I couldn't hear a word of that. I think the microphone's really bad, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so if you want to, I'm here.
Okay, sweet. That's an argument against child support systems, where there is a chance you might get infected if you
Okay, thank you. Child support systems. Okay, we're going to come on to that later, because we say that this is fundamentally different because it's to do with people's health, and we say it's because it's to do with the issue of consent. We say the proposition have not outlined how if somebody knowingly engages in sexual activity, how that changes their model. So we don't think it's as simple as child support. We don't think the blame is clear cut. No, thank you. We say, secondly, it's even more unjust because it makes AIDS a special case. We say what it does is it says we do not make, in other areas of health, one individual culpable for another's health, right? Even in cases like reckless driving, where we recognise one person might be liable, we say we don't have to pay damages in this way, specifically for providing medication in the long run. We say the distinction is not black and white. We say even when you have safe sex, there is the possibility of transmission, and we say therefore even with disclosure, even when using a condom, under their model, presumably people will still be liable. And we say more than this, not only does it make AIDS a special case in terms of health above things like hash, smoking, or any other health issues, we say it also verifies AIDS above all other sexually transmitted diseases. And we say that's very damaging. Why in particular do the proposition want to single out HIV? Sir?
Would you ever prosecute somebody who knowingly infects somebody else with HIV if you have a fundamental right to have sex with whoever you want to?
Okay, we say two things to that. We say firstly, if you knowingly infect someone with AIDS, that's like only one part of your model. And we say if damages or if any criminal action should be taken, that should happen within the criminal system, as it does in some countries now. It should not happen in terms of long-term medical payments. That's totally different. It's inconsistent. And we say secondly, by verifying AIDS, it leads to practical harms. Now, the proposition at the moment say this will be great, because what it will mean is everyone will go out and get tested by their doctors because they won't want to unknowingly transmit sexual diseases. And we say that's simply not true. We say the perception will remain that we don't want to know, because as soon as they've admitted that they are carriers of HIV, then they will know that irrespective of the type of sexual activity they enter into, they will be liable for any transmission. And we say that's hugely damaging. So we say, in actual fact, there will be huge practical harms in terms of people who do have HIV and AIDS seeking medical help. And secondly, we say it's going to increase the stigma. It sends out the message that you're to blame for the fact you have HIV. Unless the proposition wants some crazy and we just stop. So we say in either model, it's very damaging to HIV and it increases the stigma. We see this is particularly damaging when we look at how HIV positive people have been viewed in society. We see people with AIDS are already viewed in some societies as second-class citizens, and we in opposition seek to remove the view that they've taken part in some sort of promiscuous activity. We say that this is hugely damaging and we don't want to encourage the stigma. Okay, so therefore, because we say the model we've had so far is just not good enough and it's inconsistent, because we say that the right to engage in sexual activity is fundamental to people living a fulfilling life, and because we say this is a practical harm to AIDS treatment, I beg to oppose.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for her speech and invite the Deputy Prime Minister, Ms Fiona Prowse, to continue the debate for the government.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we think it was telling that at not one stage in her speech did she acknowledge the great problem that we set out from our Prime Minister's speech. The problem that individuals who are infected with HIV/AIDS are not physically or financially able to afford the drugs that they require to lead normal, healthy, not infected almost lives, ladies and gentlemen. That very obvious problem in healthcare systems was not talked about in her speech. What was also not talked about was the concept of changing sexual practices and making more people aware. And with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what she did talk about. Firstly, let's look at the model concerns that she had in today's debate, which was her biggest attack. Secondly, let's look at this idea that sex is nice and good, and I'll give you a hot tip, I like sex too, guys. And very finally, let's look at this concept of how we change AIDS, because that fits very nicely with my material about raising the awareness of HIV/AIDS in a positive way, as is done under our proposal. So let's look at the model concerns that we have, because we had a whole shocking list of them. What if these people don't have any money? How do we determine who is the victim? Ladies and gentlemen, in Tim's speech, we went to great lengths to tell you that the criminal justice system does this all the time. The criminal justice system punishes people who don't necessarily have an obvious capacity to deal with this type of an issue. And we're perfectly happy to do that on this side of the house, because we think the rights of the victim to get legitimate access to this type of healthcare are more important. It's called the law, ladies and gentlemen. It's called judges. That's how they decide who's the victim. And we think it's a pretty trivial attack from the open opposition. But then we have this idea that this isn't how laws operate. We don't consider things like long-term health costs. What utter rubbish, ladies and gentlemen. Trends in criminal law and in general civil law across the developed world go towards considering the long-term consequences of crimes. We told you in Tim's speech that it's not good enough just to morally sanction someone, that the consequences exist above and beyond that. Then we have this next idea about sex and how everyone should have a right to have sex because we all enjoy sex, ladies and gentlemen, unless we're maybe a bit drunk. We said that it's fundamentally inconsistent to the response that we got from Tim's point of information when we asked, would you punish people who knowingly, no thank you, would you punish people who knowingly infect people with HIV/AIDS? And she kind of skirted around the issue and said it's for the criminal law to deal with. We told you there's a failing in criminal law. And we think that also acknowledges that you can't just have sex no matter whenever you want, ladies and gentlemen. You can't have sex when it affects someone with a disease, ladies and gentlemen, that paralyzes them for life, that they can never hope to get rid of. And we're perfectly happy to change sex dynamics in that way on this side of the house. Finally, we heard this idea in regards to AIDS, because firstly she said this elevates AIDS above all STIs. We think that AIDS is fundamentally different to the overwhelming majority of STIs, because you can take a pill to get rid of something like thrush, ladies and gentlemen, but you can't take a pill to get rid of AIDS. All you can do is take pills that minimise the effects of something like that, a fundamental failing of the system at the moment. Very finally, we heard this idea that this just sends a message to say that you're to blame for your AIDS, ladies and gentlemen. What a simplistic analysis that we've just heard. That's not the message we send. The message we do send is that you get a right to redress, ladies and gentlemen, when you are infected with that disease. That you are to blame when you infect someone in this scenario, and that you should be careful about the sexual practices that you engage with. Yes, madam.
You've just told us that individuals are not financially able to make payment for their own treatment because they have AIDS. We say, by definition,
Okay, is that seriously your biggest issue in our case, ladies and gentlemen? Is your biggest issue that some people will fall under our model and not be able to financially pay? We'd say that even if some cases people couldn't pay for these types of services, the majority can, ladies and gentlemen, and it's important that in those situations they do get payment. Let's move on from these model concerns that we heard from opposition and look at the material that I want to talk about in today's debate. First, I want to look at the concept of greater awareness for HIV, and secondly, this idea in terms of groups specifically affected in today's debate and why they're the most vulnerable. So let's look at this first argument about the awareness of HIV/AIDS, because what we'd say is at the moment there is a failing of awareness within society. The kind of boom where consideration for AIDS was really hot in the 80s has died down. We think that's problematic because we still see rates of infection gradually increasing again in the developed world. And what we'd say, ladies and gentlemen, is that people are being lazy in their sexual practices. Tim told you, firstly, how we create direct deterrent and direct incentive to behave more responsibly during sex, ladies and gentlemen, because you can't guarantee the outcomes in these scenarios. But we think more importantly, let's look at a group of society that just doesn't have sexual awareness, people of religious backgrounds who never get taught in school about sexual awareness and wearing condoms, ladies and gentlemen. We'd say at the moment they don't and they aren't aware of the use of condoms and the very real positive change that condoms can make to sex, ladies and gentlemen. What we'd say is that our policy forces those people to become involved in this type of a concept. We think that's very positive because they're not immune to AIDS, strangely enough, ladies and gentlemen. We would like them to be more aware of this type of a policy and this type of a problem. So let's look at the second idea in regards to groups affected. Because aside from raising awareness about HIV/AIDS through different groups that aren't being touched by current government policies at the moment, we'd say that this type of the problem at the moment specifically affects groups in a disproportionate way. It specifically affects the homosexual community, and we think it disproportionately well affects African Americans. We think that's very troubling, ladies and gentlemen, because as I pointed out, they often are in a position where they can't financially pay for this type of treatment on their own volition. And we think that it is also important when they have less of a chance at having a stable, long-term job, ladies and gentlemen, because they get sick every other week because of the debilitating nature of this type of a disease. And we'd say the difference in the problem in today's debate is that a wealthy person who gets infected with AIDS under this scenario is able to afford to increase their quality and standard of living, ladies and gentlemen. Because strangely enough, we don't think that the NHS is a saving grace in today's debate where everyone gets payment for everything. Even if they pay for half, you're still over about $10,000, ladies and gentlemen. That's a hell of a lot of baht. And we don't think that most people in this type of climate, especially these groups disproportionately affected, will be able to afford it. We think it's unfair that wealthy people in today's environment are able to afford a better standard of living, and then the poor and most vulnerable in society who are disproportionately affected have no means of affording these drugs. That's the problem in today's debate, one which the opposition never once considered in their speech. We've told you that this shapes sexual practices for the better, but most importantly, we told you it creates awareness and creates a direct accountability for individuals and a redress to victims. We're very proud to propose this model of accountability.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her speech and invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr Daniel Lawrence, to continue the case for the opposition.
Mr. Chair, the argument right at the heart of today's debate is when is it acceptable, if ever, for people who are HIV positive to have sex? We say that the model sent out loud and clear by the government today is the answer to that question is never. We told you in the first opposition speech that we believe that shouldn't be the right answer on the principled level that there is a moral right to engage in sexual activity, and containing that beyond very specific limits is wrong, and also that the incentives it creates within the system for people to behave badly are increased if you do that. Because the burden set down by the proposition today was twofold. Firstly, they told us that this is a just way of allocating the costs and bearing the burdens of the costs of treating AIDS. And secondly, they told us it improves the incentives to behave properly if you HIV. I'm going to show you in my rebuttal why we think, first of all, this isn't a just way of allocating those costs, and secondly, why we think, if anything, the incentives are for people to behave even more irresponsibly. The substantive part of my case is going to be talking exactly about where the state should and should not get itself involved in defining the limits of sexual activity. I'm going to talk about the difference between criminalisation and having this kind of blanket statement that basically people with AIDS shouldn't have sex even in consensual relationships, where they told people all of the circumstances. And I'm going to look at why it's very different, where you basically are going to impose culpability on people without knowledge. But let's start at the beginning, no thank you, with this idea that this is a just way of allocating resources. Well, they told us that in their world, basically we're in a privatised healthcare system. We think actually that isn't the case in much of the developed world, where actually you are likely, if you go along to the healthcare provider, to be able to get AIDS drugs, whether or not, ladies and gentlemen, you were infected by somebody else. We think that the situation where the world they live in is one that's fundamentally unjust. If you believe we live in a world where in order to get AIDS drugs you have to pay for them, first of all, there are an awful lot of people with AIDS right now who get it through blood transfusions or other methods who won't be able to get access to this. But furthermore, you're creating a two-tier system of justice, where if you sleep with rich people with AIDS, you're going to be able to get the money to get the payment for your treatment, but if you don't, you're not going to be able to. I don't want to live in a world where whether you're able to get treatment, ladies and gentlemen, for a disease which makes your life hell depends upon whether the person who gave you that disease was rich enough to pay that. But we say more than that. What they told us is that people who have HIV aren't able to pay for that treatment. And as Barry pointed out in a point of information, the very people who you're going to expect to pay that cost have HIV themselves. We don't see the distinction in this instance. We don't see where all of this money is suddenly coming from. But also they told us, and this is even more ludicrous, that HIV affects specific groups, like gay people, ladies and gentlemen. Well, this may be a surprise to you, ladies and gentlemen, but we think that gay people might happen to have sex with other gay people. So the entire group is hit by this. They're all screwed, ladies and gentlemen. No question. And worse than that, you increase the stigma. Because you say AIDS is the sort of thing which is something we always look at for responsibility. There's always recrimination. We're always thinking about not how can we best deal with this issue, how do we deal with the fact that this person has AIDS, but whether or not there's someone else who's culpable. We think that kind of culture isn't particularly a useful one to encourage within our community. But now let's talk about the incentive to improve behaviour. Because they told us under their model, no thank you. Suddenly, mea culpa, people will realise that they should go and get tested for HIV/AIDS if they've had promiscuous activity. We say that's not the case. We say even if it is the case that people will believe that if they happen to transmit AIDS and didn't know at the time they were HIV positive, that under their model they'll be culpable, the people will still deceive themselves, no thank you, that until they actually test positive for that disease, they don't have to worry about it. We see an example of this kind of risk being taken in the gay community, where, as we know as a result of AIDS drugs being taken, you get facial deformities. After a while of taking these drugs, your face collapses. We saw an awful lot of problems in the gay community in the late 1990s of gay men who had AIDS not taking drugs because the result was it curtailed any possibility of sexual activity. Because no one wanted to sleep with somebody who looked like they were taking AIDS drugs. What that tells us, ladies and gentlemen, is there's an awful lot of people in society who put the value of having sex well above the value of their own health and their life even being tested and taking AIDS drugs which would prolong their life. What that tells us, ladies and gentlemen, is if you create a system where you're going to believe that if you're tested positive for AIDS, your sex life is over forever, then that's a problem, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't think people will want to get tested in that scenario. Tell me why that's not true.
When are you going to acknowledge that those are the exact practices that we seek to change when we create a direct financial incentive to care about whether or not sex leads to an STI?
Here's the thing. People don't act like these rational economic actors who think, what is the way in which I lead my life that leads to me ultimately paying out the most money? If they did that, they probably wouldn't have sex without a condom in the first place. The fact that these activities do go on, and the fact that criminal law does exist to prevent some of these activities, which is going to be in my substantive, we're going to talk about exactly where it is to do that, kind of suggests that that doesn't have any impact, that people behave kind of irrationally when they're doing this. What we say is what they do think, and when they see the possibility, the fact that you do have AIDS, the fact you've been tested positive for it, means the end of your sex life as far as you can then calculate it, then that's a major disincentive to ever get tested for AIDS. When you have fewer people getting tested for AIDS, the likelihood of more transmission going on is people simply don't know that they're at risk, and because they don't even want to contemplate the risks that are involved, are even greater. A society which stigmatizes people to this extent is not one where AIDS transmission falls, but firstly it's one where it increases, and that's something they haven't dealt with. But why do we think actually that this is incredibly unfair? Because we think that under the status quo, yes, it is legitimate to criminalise people who know of their HIV status and sleep with people without telling their partners. What we say is this model goes a step further. It says that even in a situation where you tell your sexual partner all of the facts, all of the circumstances, and you wear a condom, that if you're unlucky enough in those scenarios when the condom breaks or whatever to pass on the HIV virus, that you're culpable there. We think that's incredibly damaging. Not only because it means that culpability extends well beyond people who actually are being good behaving well, but also it curtails that right to engage in legitimate sexual activity, which people perceive as so fundamentally important that it affects their decision as whether to seek treatment. But fundamentally it also lumps in two groups together. It lumps in those groups who actually do bother to tell their partners about all of the details, and those who don't. And it says exactly the same circumstances apply to both scenarios. And we think that's an incredibly damaging message to send out, because we think there's a huge moral distinction between someone who behaves responsibly when they have AIDS and yes, does want to engage in sexual activity, albeit when they have a consenting partner who knows all of the facts. That's a distinction that society has to make if people with AIDS are to be treated fairly. Their model doesn't do that, and I proudly stand in opposition today.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his speech and would like to invite Mr. Samir Degasen to open the case for closing government.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to bring you from closing is the idea that sex should always be seen as a joint venture between two parties, but there should never be a situation of sex where costs are imposed simply on one individual and not on both, and we think that's fundamental. And secondly, explain why HIV is a special case, both in terms of its cost and in terms of the fact that it's particularly serious. But firstly, I want to deal with what we got from the opposition, because it was just so crazy, ladies and gentlemen. But the entire logic of their case was that, these, ranty attack on the idea that people who got AIDS, HIV, won't be able to have sex anymore. That's just not true, ladies and gentlemen. We're not denying them their right to have sex. We're saying because they have HIV, they have differential responsibilities than people who don't have HIV. And under those circumstances, they have to take, they have to be aware that those consequences might lead to someone else having to live the rest of their lives on drugs. And that decision needs to be a shared decision, a consensual decision, and in fact both people have to have a stake in that decision. We think that's really fundamental that they have that discussion. We're not denying them their right to have sex. Then they say this totally stigmatizes anyone with HIV, which is just confusing, ladies and gentlemen. Like we just don't see why there's any normative element at all in this policy. This just simply says the fact of you having HIV makes your life different to the fact of not having HIV. And thank you. You can't just put your head in the sand and say, let's pretend like no one has HIV, even if you do. It does change your life. We don't think there's a normative element of stigmatizing them, but we say there is an element of saying you need to take greater care and greater responsibility. But also, if you really believe in this stigma argument, that's actually an argument for our side. Because yes, especially in societies that are already, which is what they said, societies where people with HIV are already stigmatized, that possibly means those people at the point where they contract HIV probably can't pay. We think at the point people will suddenly say, their families won't look after them, their friends won't look after them, say, you've got HIV, you're the sort of person we don't want to pay for. We think that makes it an additional burden on the state to help them out. So thank you. And then finally, this argument, where they say people won't get tested if they think it ends their sex life. But under the status quo, people have zero incentive to be tested because the cost is always imposed on the other person. And thank you. So why should you go to get tested? Because if you get tested, it's kind of scary and horrible. And if you don't get tested, well, I'll just carry on having sex as if nothing was wrong, and who will pay? The other person will pay, not me. We think that's ridiculous in terms of incentives. So firstly, this idea of sex as joint venture, because we just think that in principle, ladies and gentlemen, no sexual encounter should ever exist which imposes costs just on one person, but doesn't impose costs on the other. We think sexual responsibility and sexual ethics are something which involve a consensual dialogue between both parties, where both parties have knowledge of exactly what's going on, and we think that's fundamental. We say what happens under the status quo is, I'll take your head, Mary, what happens under the status quo is individuals can have sex with someone and impose all of the costs, and someone who's an HIV can have sex with someone and impose all of the costs on them. They then give HIV to that person has to live all their life or antiretroviral drugs, that particular sexual encounter never harmed the person who actually gave HIV to the other person. Even in situations, though, where the other person consents to having sex, but still, the responsibility is not shared. They're free to take on all of the responsibility. The victim, as the first proposition called it, or indeed the person who has sex with the HIV person, they take on the responsibility of fully paying that. We think that's unfair because we think the sexual contract is something which should be shared between both parties. Go.
Okay, if you're so concerned about a balanced relationship, why, when an individual consents to have sex with someone they know to have HIV, why should only one person pick up two bills, and why should they...
For a couple of reasons. One is that we think in practice, a lot of the power relationships in those situations are slightly disturbing. Like we think when someone consents to have sex with someone else with HIV, they're often coerced into doing so, and they often don't fully and are rationally informed about the consequences of doing so. We think that's a problem. We think even if they're not, that's not an argument against our case. Our case is simply that both parties share the responsibility once that happens. So even if someone consents to having sex with someone with HIV, why should they in principle have to bear all the costs of that? We just don't think they do. We think both parties have responsibility to bear the costs, even when there is consent on both sides. We just think that's the logical alimony. Even when there's consent on both sides, we still say the cost of raising a child is borne by both parties because it's a fair distribution of burdens. We think that's just fair. We also think, ladies and gentlemen, in practice, this has a lot of good fallout benefits. We think, firstly, it will encourage a pre-sex discussion because both sides have some responsibility to share those burdens. So there's not this sort of pushy, coercive type of logic that we see under the status quo. We see discussion between both parties and we say, is this a good idea? Should we actually have sex? Where you see the victim individual, thank you, saying, look, I actually think that you may have a cost to do this. If you have sex with me, you actually will have to pay a lot. And that individual saying, I must take responsibility for it as well. We think that one of the big problems with sexual encounters is the fact that there's not enough discussion, not enough actual discussion of the consequences that happen. We think more of that is better. But we also think, basically, this encourages testing, I've already explained this, testing at the point beforehand, because now the responsibilities are shared. Under the status quo, there is really no incentive to get tested. It's actually quite scary to find out you have HIV. It's not particularly helpful to you. The only person who really incurs the cost is the other individual. We think that's a huge problem, and we think that creates no incentive under the status quo. No time. So why is HIV a special case? Well, because we think, more than any other serious illness, individuals have a degree of control when they give HIV to someone else. Because ultimately, this policy can logically be applied to any communicable disease, right? Why is it HIV specific? We think they have this control manifests itself in two ways. Firstly, we think they have prior knowledge, potentially, of having HIV. But if they don't have prior knowledge, no thank you, we think they have an absolute responsibility to get checked. So in situations which very important, thank you, crazy, where we impose a cost on someone who hasn't been tested and has sex with someone and gives them HIV, we think that's not crazy. We think they have a responsibility to check themselves. We think everyone always has a responsibility before they engage in sexual intercourse, knowing the risks, to check themselves. So there's control at that point. We also have control at the point of having the choice to have sex and at the point of choosing to use a condom. So we say individuals always are able to control the process through which they have sex. Therefore, the only reasons they could ever be where we think that you actually give HIV to someone else are cases where there's malice involved, which we think is incredibly dangerous, or absolute negligence, which we think again is something that we should punish. We do punish negligence all the time in law. And we think even in consensual cases, which is what the entire case is based on, and it's actually a minority of cases, but anyway, even in those cases, it's a fair distribution, and we think that's good. Finally, we think that HIV is a sub-point of this broader point, but HIV is an extremely cost-based illness, right? It's an illness where if you can't get access to antiretroviral drugs, it actually can impose a cost on you for the whole of your life that's incredibly difficult. We say in those conditions, it's an illness which actually can be alleviated massively through having enough money to be able to support yourself. We think given that it's such a cost-based illness, when money is so important in the resolution of that illness, it's doubly important that we allow the state to intervene and to actually help out victims in this case. For all these reasons, we urge you to support this motion.
I thank the government member for his speech and invite the member of the opposition, Mr. Chris Croak from Sydney A, to continue the opposition vote.
Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not quite sure what goes on in the bedroom at Oxford, but if it involves the language of contract and mutual responsibility, quite frankly, I'm a little disturbed. In this debate, what we're going to be bringing you is three distinct things. The first thing that we're going to be doing to you, perhaps, is analysis of why, in terms of its intersection with the law, this policy is basics in comparison to some very basic principles of justice. The second thing that we're going to be doing is showing that the problem and the potential benefits these guys point to are so illusory at best that we think this motion falls. The third thing we're going to be looking at is how, with specific reference to victims, this is actually a policy that is not in their interest. But to the first thing that I want to talk about. The first thing that we argue in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen, is that we think a fundamental principle of the justice system is that people don't get punished twice. We totally agree with people being put in prison when they knowingly infect others with HIV. But we would suggest that if they're doing that time, they don't need to be doubly punished in this instance. But secondly, we would suggest there's always going to be a pretty basic problem of them being able to afford the drug treatments if they're in prison. Like, you can't just make enough number plates to pay for antiretroviral treatments, ladies and gentlemen. But the third reason why we resent the idea of double punishment is that we think in this instance it could possibly come at the possible death of the victim and then death of the offender and then compromising their own medical treatments, which not only means that they suffer, it means that the third parties that are say related to them suffer. The second thing we would say with respect to a legal analysis of this particular problem is that this side of the house wants to set a standard of people unknowingly being strictly liable for the infection of another. Now, they talk about how they wanted courts to adjudicate, and yet they didn't even empower a court to do this. They empowered a statutory authority. Now, we would suggest that intent in any justice system matters, because we don't think people should be punished when they unknowingly commit any sort of offence. Because we think it's a basic principle that we don't punish people without any sort of intent, without any form of guilty conscience. The third thing that we would say as to why this is a particularly dangerous and unjust punishment is that it disproportionately affects the poor. Because this is a system where essentially only poor people are ever going to be really hurt by it. Because rich people can effectively outsource any problems with their conduct by just signing the check every month. But it's going to be the poor that are going to be slung with the burden of this particular problem. And we think that that's, again, a particularly unjust form of punishment. Sir?
We doubly punish people all the time in criminal and civil cases. A criminal sanction is transitory. The lifetime illness, people don't have to pay for the drugs that you need.
So the difference is that in a civil setting, you still have a basic standard of intent, which we think is fundamentally important. You don't have any civil crime where there's no intent as a basic ingredient of that crime, because we recognise that it's a very fundamental principle that progressive societies hold to. What then have we heard from the government in this debate justifying this problem? The first thing they wanted to talk about was the need to introduce care in the bedroom. Now, there was no analysis of why prison was an insufficient disincentive to do this. Why, say, for example, the prospective idea of future compensation was such a big thing compared to prison. But the second thing was that there was no analysis of why this is the only way to achieve care in the bedroom. We think that using the justice system to aid public relations campaigns is a pretty stupid idea. The reason why there might be a problem of awareness is because the Grim Reaper campaigns don't run on TV anymore. And in that instance, why not just run them as a sensible alternative? The second thing that the closing government wanted to suggest is that people need further incentives to go get tested. Well, we would say the very possibility you might have an illness like HIV is a pretty big incentive to go get tested. Because you might die, for example, and we don't think that's a sufficient reason to introduce this particular proposal. The third problem that we heard from them was this idea that somehow sex was a joint venture. Well, firstly, we're disturbed in the application of the language of contract to that. But secondly, when we look at the examples of, when they want to talk about mutual responsibility, well, we would suggest that often in the instance that this was happening in a relationship, that would be fine, that there would be an acceptance of some sort of mutual responsibility. But in this instance, they want to punish people who don't even know that they've done it, and only punish that person. There's no analysis of how they can adjudicate that, or how they can actually work out who was the victim. The third thing that I want to talk about in my speech is why this is particularly bad for victims. But before I do, Samir.
You're just very confused. This is not a criminal punishment. It is a compensation for negligence, like happens in every civil court in the world.
No, sir. Negligence is still a form of intent. And in this case, you're imposing it as a strict liability offence. But even if it was the case, that this was just for negligence, we still think it's a bad idea. And that's for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen. We think this is bad for victims because, firstly, it undermines government's incentives to actually invest in the healthcare of people with HIV, outsourcing responsibility of it to an offender rather than, say, the government. And we've used the analogy of child support payments to suggest that it's actually very dangerous to create an ongoing reliance on a particular person other than the state to sum up these particular payments. We see a massive problem across every Western democracy of fathers not paying and mothers not having the resources to litigate in the courts to get them to pay. It suggests sending the message that there's the responsibility of offenders and not governments to actually provide these treatments, actually undermines government incentives to invest and means they'll never get the treatments to begin with. But the second thing that we would suggest that it does, and why it's bad for victims, is because it increases a psychological hold over the victim. Because the very treatment that you're giving in terms of antiretroviral treatments is designed to rehabilitate someone, to keep AIDS in remission. And we think a system where their very treatment is dependent on the generosity of the offender permanently is one which only increases the psychological hold of the offender over the victim and undermines that capacity to rehabilitate. And we see that in many cases in the instance of prison labour in states like Louisiana, where victims are actually not particularly helped by a group because there's an ongoing dependence on the actual offender. Madam Speaker, this proposal will fall because it doesn't help victims, it unfairly punishes offenders, and it doesn't help society.
I thank the member of the opposition for his speech and invite the government whip, Mr. Lewis Ewan, to conclude the case for closing government.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, Chris stood up and just didn't understand what tort law is, or what negligence law is, ladies and gentlemen. This is about conversation. It's about a social policy to address the long-term damages to a person in a contractual relationship, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think Chris can stand and say, well, this doesn't fit into our principles of criminal justice, and ignore the fact that we actually made this about civil law, ladies and gentlemen. We made this about social contributions, and intent actually doesn't matter, ladies and gentlemen, when you consider things negligence. So I'm going to look at two things, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to look at how I visualise sex happening. And I'm going to look at various conceptual frameworks, ladies and gentlemen, on that. Second of all, we're going to get the practical fallout, ladies and gentlemen, of this policy and the alleged practical arguments they've made. So first of all, let's look at how we visualise sex happening on this side of the house. And we say, yeah, perhaps maybe it's telling that we didn't have much sex in Oxford. But I do think, ladies and gentlemen, it's really important, and it's what's more important to the table, that we conceptualise sex as a contractual arrangement, ladies and gentlemen. That when you go and you say to someone, I want to have sex with you, you also say, I implicitly bear all the consequences of the sexual act, ladies and gentlemen. We say it's pretty irresponsible for you not to get checked. No, thank you. We say in our world, everyone should get checked if you're going to be a sexually active person. And in response, ladies and gentlemen, even if there's a 0.2% or whatever chance of you, even if you use a condom, ladies and gentlemen, and this is the basis of their opposition, that you could use a condom, take all the safe practices, and still be punished for this. But we say tough. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, you implicitly accept all the consequences. That's why I think if you use a condom and with a woman and you produce a baby, ladies and gentlemen, if it might happen, we say it's not a good defence for you to say, oh, you use the condom. We say you still index child support payments. So thank you. That's the nature of what you get into. It's one of the things which makes us human, treatment, ladies and gentlemen, is a key part of who we are. These guys are absolutely right. That's why I say that principles and stand. Then there's this weird sort of right to sex argument, which morphed into, this is a bad policy because it shifts our way of thinking about sex and therefore it limits our way of thinking about sex. We say it makes people more responsible, like 1 second, then we say it's a good thing. We say that's an argument against all the child support arguments which say support men's mental health. There's an argument against people for having sex with animals or children or their brothers and sisters. We say it's not really a strong argument to argue this somehow limits people's ability to have any type of sex they want. Go.
Samir's online response as to why when there's an equal burden of consent, there should be an unequal burden of payment, is that where there's HIV, there's often coercion. We say if that's true, then that's rape, Madam Speaker. And if you're a victim of rape, then under your model, you probably don't want to ask your perpetrator to make payment.
Okay, look, for a start, ladies and gentlemen, we say it's not a situation where you have a victim and then you have the person who's raped you, you have to go up to them and beg them. And this is what Chris said, it creates a psychological dependency. You have to go to the person who you're in charge, who caused you to have that particular form of HIV. We said the state compels you to do so. The state takes money away from you and places it in the hands of the victim. So we don't say there's that link there, ladies and gentlemen. You get money from a person who commits an act against you. We say most people who've been raped and who contract HIV, ladies and gentlemen, probably would be happy with getting that particular type of payment. Bear in mind the high cost of HIV treatment. We don't think that's really a good point. And then the third argument on this issue of how we approach sex is this incentives argument, ladies and gentlemen. Because we say there's a high cost, ladies and gentlemen, imposed if you have to financially contribute to someone's well-being and health afterwards, especially if they live for a long time. Now these guys say, well, there are lots of people who like to have crazy sex who don't use condoms. We say, well, put it like this, ladies and gentlemen. Like baby fathers, the term they use in America, there are lots of people who do have irresponsible sex and have children and pay child support. And we say it's a once-bitten, twice-shy approach to things, ladies and gentlemen. Because if you have had to pay for the contribution towards somebody's treatment, we say that actually does factor into a calculus, ladies and gentlemen. That's how the incentive point works. And we say, no thank you. We say that's more likely to happen if you have had a drain of your income because you were irresponsible, because you were engaged in giving someone HIV, ladies and gentlemen, even though you didn't mean to do so. So we say that's a valuable thing on our side, ladies and gentlemen. Even if you don't buy this as argument and we say it does work, it works after the fact that you had to do it the second time round. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, it's important. So maybe what you did analysis of the right post, so thank you. Pre-sex discussions are important, ladies and gentlemen, and people should take an approachable response to their sex. We haven't heard a response from those guys, so thank you. Let's do the practical arguments, ladies and gentlemen, and the practical fallout. Because we say, on a simple level, when you share the cost of a treatment, it's less harsher on an individual. We came to analysis as to why AIDS is a cost-driven illness, ladies and gentlemen. That your chances of, I'll accept Chris in a second, your chances of living longer are affected by your ability to pay. We say often, ladies and gentlemen, given that these people often are in low social economic statuses, given that these people, and you're right, do suffer from stigma, and we say it's more likely that you don't have support from your family, ladies and gentlemen, if you've contracted HIV in some instances, ladies and gentlemen. You don't have a job because you're too ill. We say what that does is it shares the burden of cost, and on a much more sensible level, that means that it's less costly and you're more likely to live for longer. It's not just you, but someone else contributing. Go.
So these incentives still have HIV and people still need to be able to afford treatment. Why is the just outcome that they're effectively impoverished and denied those treatments?
Because we say ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, if you have HIV and you go and infect someone, ladies and gentlemen, just say tough. Like keep on making this argument. That's the nature of contractual arrangement. If your point is, and it comes down now to my next point is practical argument, there are poor people who won't be able to pay, or we say, okay, obviously if you have no money, like we're not going to, like this policy doesn't apply to you. We said there are lots of people who this falls under who do have the ability to pay their insurance. We said that's exactly applicable to child benefits. And then there was this whole practical spiel about, how do you tell? Again, ladies and gentlemen, we say in the way we're able to make links and tell in certain jurisdictions where somebody has to be responsible for causing someone to get AIDS, we can use those systems. We don't think it's a big problem. And we don't think it's a big problem, ladies and gentlemen, when these guys have to say, well, it reduces government incentives to tackle AIDS. We say it's in every government's interest to tackle AIDS, it was a silly point. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we don't buy the government's calculus like it just shifts, but it's particular policy. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we see it as a joint venture, as a contractual agreement. It's not within the criminal framework that these guys put. But ultimately, if you're going to have sex with someone, you have to bear the consequences later. Even though those consequences have dire economic effects, we say that's the nature of the agreement, that's the nature of sex. People should take much more of an active control over their sex life, ladies and gentlemen. People should have post-sex discussions. We say this issue about rights just as non-existent. It's for these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, and for the fact that these practical arguments don't hold in this particular debate, that we stand here proudly on side of the opposition. Thank you very much.
I thank the government whip for his speech and invite Mr. Don Urban, the opposition whip, to conclude today's debate.
Thanks very much, Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. The government benches in today's debate try to skirt the issue that they are impoverishing people who by definition themselves have AIDS and are being sentenced to death if they can't afford treatment by saying there is an overarching interest. And that overriding interest that we have to preserve is one, changing sexual practice so people treat it more like a contract, and two, making sure that because it's a cost-based illness, people with AIDS can afford treatment. I'm going to do 4 things in my speech. First is look at our extension, which demonstrated that even if the government benches model achieved that end of reforming sexual practice, it's still too high a price to pay because of the way it undermines the justice system itself. The second thing I'd like to do is look at the notion of the nature of sex as a joint venture, then the idea of sexual practice itself, and finally the notion of healthcare and AIDS being different because the treatment for AIDS is expensive. In our extension in today's debate, we said that this is too high a price to pay, the benefits that suggested come at too high a price for 4 reasons. One, because it fundamentally breaches the notion of the criminal justice system that we only punish people once. But the second reason we gave is that these people didn't have intent. And Oxford stood up in their case and said, well, actually, in civil negligence cases, we don't require intent. Well, one, in many you actually do require intent. That's a misunderstanding of law. But secondly, look at the principle behind it. The reason criminal cases require higher burdens is because the punishment that you dole out in criminal cases is so much more severe. Burdens of proof should go up as the punishment you're doling out goes up. And in your guys' interest, in the instance of you guys, you're impoverishing people with AIDS. Lewis conceded that's effectively a death sentence that you think they happily signed up to. In that, the least we can do is afford those people the privilege of at least having the fact that they had no idea they were doing anything wrong as a defense to that action. The third problem with their model is that it massively disproportionately affects poor people, a point that was left frustratingly unaddressed by the government benches in today's debate. There's no problem with implement a system where rich people can write a check and poor people die of AIDS because they can't afford treatments. Samir.
All compensation can potentially impoverish people, but we can remove their liberty and their criminal cases. This is just like any other...
No, in my mind, sir, life and liberty are relatively inextricably linked, and dead people have little liberty. This is a particularly pernicious type of impoverishingness because you guys said all throughout the case that AIDS is expensive. And the final problem is, well actually I guess the final problem in my last point I think, because I just decided it fits better there. So the second thing I'd like to do to look at in today's debate is, given those overriding harms, what was the benefits that they suggested? In the closing half, they suggested the key benefit was that it changes our nature of sex to think of it more as a joint venture contract. One, sex isn't a contract. Sex is sex. And to talk about it as a contract is a useful analogy, but it doesn't mean that we should be punishing people for breaching a contract because it's analogous to a contract. They didn't sign it in a contract. But secondly, let's just assume it's a contract. Contracts presuppose knowledge of both parties, and you're punishing people for signing up to a contract that they didn't know they had AIDS in. So we think it breaches contract by analogy anyway. Thirdly, we think that if you really want to make people value sex more highly, like we think there's already a general trend towards people viewing sex more as a contract. Increasingly harsh rape laws, increasingly frowned upon societal stance of men pressuring women into sex. We think that's a trend anyway, and we're not prepared to suffer the harms, so you guys can be happy that the analogy is now common throughout society of sex as a contract. So So what did we get from the opening half in terms of the benefits of sex? They said it will practically change the way people have sex. To which we have three responses. Take them in one second. To which we have three responses. One, there's lots of ways to practically change it. Chris suggested the astounding option of reintroducing the ads that everyone conceded worked so well. And, considering that he responds to that, presumably they think that's a pretty good idea. But secondly, we just see laws and potential far-off economic punishments aren't particularly good ways of changing people's sexual practice. In my humble experience, sexual practice is much more dictated by alcohol consumption rather than by our potential far-off monetary claims. And finally, that only affects people who knowingly have AIDS, and we don't think that it will affect other people.
Tom, impoverishing people is nothing compared to the inability of most people to pay for drugs that they need as a result of a disease they never consented to. Your side does nothing to help.
Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. The idea that the overriding benefit here is actually that we get to provide health care for people with AIDS, because that was kind of where the debate started, in speech. So we'd say a few things to that. One, under their model, people are being denied the capacity to be treated for AIDS. In their model, that just so happens that often those people who can't afford treatment made the unfortunate mistake of accidentally affecting someone with AIDS. So it's not like they're treating everyone. Secondly, the idea that AIDS is expensive and people need drugs just means that someone should pay. And actually, under the status quo, in the majority of first world countries, they already get compensation from, medical payments from the government to treat them. So, and this was Chris's point, he wasn't responding to. What their model does is it shifts the burden off the state to make sure that people have access to healthcare and puts it on the perpetrators of crime to make sure that people get healthcare. That's just a recipe for people, and the failure of childcare systems to ensure that single mothers where the father has to pay child support payment, the failure of that system demonstrates when the state washes its hands and puts it on victims, generally people suffer. So we don't think that they actually make sure people get treated for AIDS. And finally, we'd actually say that when it also comes to the long-term health of patients, we actually think the psychological hold that perpetrators of crimes get over their victims can often offset any of the gains that they've suggested. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, they're trying to sort of claim the moral high ground by saying people with AIDS have a really, really bad life, so someone should pay. And we agree, but we just think embracing a model that doesn't guarantee their health and undermines the state's capacity to help them, whilst undermining the justice system too, ultimately fails. And for those reasons, we're proud to report.